What I'll do in that case is just officially welcome everyone. So you have already seen that there was a little message that this workshop is being recorded. What we are going to record is really just the input from our amazing speakers, and then we will turn the recording off for the question and answer discussion slots. So people should feel confident to ask anything, but at the same time, we think that this is an important session and we'd like to capture what people are telling us. So let me just very briefly introduce us and the project and the scheme that this is part of. So you can see Dr. Sophie Kinhill there and myself, Katarina Kasia, and there's Joanne. We're all part of a UniWell grant team, and I think I've also seen Manuela somewhere. We've got an amazing team, and we're working together on a project that is called Mastery. It's funded by a scheme called UniWell. So we've got amazing partners in Sweden, Italy, and the Netherlands. And the background really is that Sophie and I, who both at the University of Birmingham, started talking at some point because we work in very different disciplines, but we have an important thing in common, and that is that we work on topics that are widely regarded as sensitive, and also that some aspects of the research that we do can really only be described as grim, I guess, and as quite challenging. And we do this work because we really care, and because I guess we want to work towards less violent futures, and that's obviously something that we have in common with a lot of other people, with activists, with researchers, with teachers, with people in all sorts of different sectors. And one thing that we found is that there seemed to be some amazing training and support in some institutions, but not in others. And academia seems to be one of those, at least for a lot of people. So today is about bringing people together from different backgrounds to explore some key questions. One is really, how do people cope when dealing with traumatic experiences and sensitive cases in a professional context? And then another question is, how do we recognize signs of trauma in ourselves and in people around us? And what can we do about that? And then the third question really is, how do we assess even when it is safe to encourage someone to open up about trauma and traumatic experiences? And we will get some input from three amazing experts today. We will introduce each speaker before their talks, and each talk will be followed by ample time for questions and discussions and a short comfort break. So we're not going to just power through 3 hours. We will definitely finish by 12 o'clock UK time. And you can pop in and out as you need to. There's just 3 practical points that I wanted to mention. So we are recording the presentation, as I said, but we're not going to record the conversations after the talks. This is the webinar format. So if you have questions or comments, the way to share them with us is to use the chat function, and then one of us who are on screen will raise them. And then the third point that I wanted to say, and I think that's fairly obvious, but we reserve the right to ignore comments or questions that we consider inappropriate or disrespectful, because that's not what we want, what we're about here. So if you have any questions about these kind of practical points, at least I don't have to show you the fire exits and all of the other things that we have to do if we organize an in-person event. But yeah, and it's great to bring people together from different backgrounds and in different countries and time zones. But that always also comes with some challenges. So we'll see how we get on with that today. Without further ado, do feel free to pop messages and questions in the chat. But I will just then now pass on to Sophie, who will introduce our first amazing speaker.
Yeah, so hi everyone. It gives me really great pleasure to introduce David Russell. So David is Community Safety and Justice Manager at Midlothian Council, where he's the strategic lead within justice services. Prior to this, he was a senior practitioner with Barnardo's, specialising in work with children and young people displaying harmful sexual behaviour and who had experienced sexual abuse or exploitation. David has extensive experience in providing assessments and interventions for vulnerable children, adolescents and adults within the field of sexual harm and violence, and has also worked in custodial settings. He currently sits on the National Organisation for the Treatment of Sexual Abuse Scotland Executive Committee and is the chair of the Community Justice Scotland Network. He is also the chair of the advisory board for the third sector organisation Thriving Survivors, in which he supports the practice and national development of restorative justice in cases of sexual harm. So over to you, David.
Okay, thank you. I'll just share my screen. 1 second. Okay. Apologies, 1 sec. Okay, can you see that okay?
Yeah, that's
Yeah,
fine.
super, thank you. Okay, well, first of all, thank you for inviting me along today to take part in this piece of work. I suppose what I'm potentially going to bring today is kind of considerations predominantly focused on my own experience working in a range of different fields, as you've just heard about. And I suppose really kind of looking at some of the impacts personally that has on people, then also looking at, I suppose, kind of interventions in terms of what I've felt is supportive within a practice role, but also within a kind of data analysis role as well. So in terms of the subject we're looking at is in terms of complex and sensitive, and I think from the bio that Sophie just read out, I think we'll agree that certainly some of the roles I've held have been certainly sensitive and most definitely complex in the way that we work with people and also how we kind of self-manage to support ourselves. So I'll just give you a little kind of background in terms of, I suppose, some of the experiences that I had within the roles. So my first experience of this world was joining the Scottish Prison Service as an operational prison officer. I went into the prison service with a real kind of passion in terms of kind of helping and supporting people. And I suppose that was the driver in terms of what I wanted to achieve. Within that, I quite quickly, you know, as we're fully experienced in terms of when we're young, we think we can potentially change the world. And sometimes when we walk into these institutions, it's quite a shock to the system. And it definitely takes a lot of getting used to. Within my role within as a prison officer, I suppose kind of some of the main things that I wanted to pull out in terms of the context of the background of this role was predominantly suicide risk management. Very quickly, I had to kind of experience, I suppose, both suicide and self-harm at quite an extensive level and really see the vulnerability within prisons, an area that I've been completely honest, I had never really given the same level of thought to. We have a kind of the idea of what prison looks like, and vulnerability isn't always the first thing that comes to mind. So very quickly, that was certainly an experience I had. Exposure to people that are in prison for sexual and violent crimes. We have this, again, idea of what we're going into, but actually often when we walk in, it's completely different to what we expect. So very quickly, actually, one of the big conflicts for me was we had this kind of idea of really what someone who had committed a sexual offence looked like, what they would be like. And it was very negative in terms of what we think of these people. But what become really conflicting is when we go into prison and we start working with these people, and we realise actually the fundamental fact is the people. And it becomes very conflicting at the early stages in terms of when people are very likeable. But we know that, again, the crimes they've committed are potentially extremely violent or have been very abusive. So these are all kind of, I suppose, themes that I felt were really important to capture today in terms of some of my reflections of walking into the prison service and actually thinking about some of these conversations that we would maybe not have out loud, which I'll explore in a little bit. Critical incident response was another theme. So actually in these environments, not really knowing what was going to happen and when. So really quickly experiencing things like staff alarms. etc. Was one of the kind of core themes, and actually realising that this environment was volatile, and at times we had to be really aware constantly about what could potentially happen and when. The kind of last role I held within the Scottish Prison Service was supporting family contact. So as a family contact officer, really having to, I suppose, see the value, see the benefit in terms of family members coming up and what that could do to people in prison and how that can support people's rehabilitation by having family contact. But the other theme for me in there was also was actually the impact that you could physically see. Again, the impact on yourself of identifying this is a person that's got a family that is coming into this, that's came into this environment. So it really kind of humanized almost in some way, which sometimes at an early stage was quite difficult to manage in terms of thinking about the person opposed to just the institution. So that time at the SPS kind of taught me, I suppose, quite a lot in terms of got me thinking about people, and I'm going to go on and talk about some of the experiences within that in the next slide. But from the Scottish Prison Service, I moved on to Barnardo's, and I was a senior practitioner at Barnardo's Early Intervention Service. My role within Barnardo's was quite extensive, I suppose, and we covered a range of themes. We were predominantly funded as a child sexual abuse and exploitation service, but really quickly identified the branches and that this ran with. So within this role, I would frequently experience survivors of child sexual abuse. We would constantly be working to disturb child sexual exploitation and intervene when possible. The other theme was the harmful sexual behaviour work that was my kind of main role, so supporting young people that have been displaying harmful sexual behaviour towards other children. And then the other conflict here was in terms of learning disability, so actually supporting young people displaying harmful sexual behaviour that also had a learning disability. That kind of led us into a range of fields, and also I suppose it was about being able to see the whole kind of child once again. Sibling sexual abuse, so we also utilise kind of restorative practices and reunifying families affected by sibling sexual abuse. We frequently experienced and were exposed to neglect and maltreatment of children, and also missing children, so children that were absconding from care. And then I moved on to this role, which was quite a leap in terms of where we went next. Now, I'm completely embedded within a kind of justice social work team, and within my role, I suppose we have kind of oversight in terms of what justice looks like and what we choose to deliver on. One of the main kind of aspects of this role is my work within restorative justice, which we have been providing. Within restorative justice in Midlothian, we're currently ranging in cases, so we're one of the only kind of local authorities to support restorative justice and sexual harm, and we also use restorative practice within cases of murder as well. The staff responsibilities was certainly something else that's kind of changed, I suppose, my working dynamic in terms of not just having to self-care for myself, but also having to be really mindful and self-care for others that I'm responsible for, and ensuring that their well-being is being properly supported. The impact, so when I'd always kind of experienced in terms of crime, I had this background of seeing the aftermath of crime, but actually within this service, it's been quite different in terms of having that direct contact with immediate crime. So crimes such as homicide, where we are living the current experience, particularly within the restorative work, where we are meeting family members that have been affected by homicide and supporting some practices to help them understand and get the questions answered that they've never been able to process. That takes on a range of different areas in terms of what that takes from yourself and how we actually manage and support people, but also how we maintain our own kind of well-being, which again I'll cover as we go through. But I think the bit that I probably miss kind of appreciated the most was data and analysis. So we always have this kind of presumption of data analysis, it's back office, and we have this kind of attitude of it's not front line. But what became really, really apparent was when working with the crime analyst that we have in post was actually the impact of the data and the analysis was really, really quite significant. So not these frontline experiences were obviously difficult, traumatic at times, but actually the data and analysis, it was quite quickly became apparent that there was a real underappreciation of the impact of reading content and processing data that reflects some of the stuff that I've just talked about just now. So that's certainly something that we've definitely had to look on, and I'll cover that just in a little bit. So in terms of overview of experiences within these organisations, the Scottish Prison Service, as I said, there was a number of kind of themes that I certainly felt were really kind of interesting in terms of how we did this and how we managed to get through these days. One of the things with the prison service that I know that has certainly improved compared to when I was in the service was actually at the very beginning. I was 22 years old, had no experience of working with people, and joined the Scottish Prison Service and had a course, a 12-week course. After 12 weeks, I was handed a baton, a set of keys, and sent into a high security prison. Now, there's something in that, and there's something really that I constantly reflect on about how we can possibly be, when we could possibly be ready for this environment. But what was really apparent was the reliance on other people in terms of staff and the importance of having good staff teams beside younger staff joining the service. But actually, when we think about that, could we ever be prepared after 12 weeks to go into that type of environment? I'm not convinced. And I think it was really much, you know, I've got massive admiration for older staff in these organisations that do see the need to support younger staff. But obviously that isn't everybody. And in terms of some of the kind of systems in the prison service, it became really clear to me that there was a number of reasons why people joined the service, and some of them more positive than others. For me, I was adamant I was joining the Scottish Prison Service to make a difference, to make a change. I didn't like the stigma that was attached to people in custody, and was really clear I wanted to see the best in everybody, I suppose, and I was an absolute advocate for rehabilitation. But when I came into this service as a young person, it was clear within staff teams that wasn't necessarily a shared view. There was the attitudes of actually people can't be changed. There was the attitudes of we're just here for the pension. There was the egotistical attitudes that you could clearly see in terms of the power balance that someone had as a prison officer. So those were all really quite conflicting kind of themes, certainly for me at the time, and how we determined some of that work. Within the prison service, I cannot really remember an experience of direct supervision. There was nothing really in terms of, we didn't have the level of supervision that we see in social work or third sector practice teams. We would have kind of infrequent team meetings, but really your supervision was purely reliant on having conversations with staff or requesting time with a manager at times. But there was no real structures in place. The big thing that happened is it was a very reactive environment. So if there had been a critical incident, or if there had been an experience of a staff member had experienced a suicide, what you'd be offered was, excuse me, at that point, you'd be offered a counselling session. So you would go and meet someone, you could request to go and meet someone. But that had a real issue for me as well, because what was really clear was in this kind of quite tough, strong environment, there was a real fear of being identified as being weak. And it was never something I ever really struggled with, to be honest, in terms of that, because I felt that it was something that we're all human, we all had to take part, we all had to experience these things, and we should be taking the help that's available to get us through this. But sometimes you could see within staff teams that actually accessing counselling after an incident, there was a fear of being determined that actually they needed to go to that session. We didn't. So there was quite a divide in that. So that did definitely for me disrupt people's ability to access help and support. And I think that was really quite something that was worth noting. And similar to that in experiences of kind of violence, where we would see a kind of an experience would be a slashing, for example, and then in a hall. That was a really, really horrific experience to witness. But what again became really clear was it could almost be kind of misinterpreted as resilience at times, of actually the tolerance to violence became so much that actually people, it was banked to the side. But then what we would often see is really long extended periods of sick 6 months later, where people had been involved in certain experiences that never had actually access to support at that time. However, you would see quite frequent periods of sick leave for long periods of time, people just move in halls and move in areas of the prison after experiencing these themes. So that was, there was a lot there to kind of capture, and I'll cover that a little bit more in impact and intervention. Within Bernardo's, I suppose my motivation to move to Bernardo's was I wanted to be part of something in relation to early intervention and support people prior to them getting to the point of prison. So very quickly I became aware that the level of adversity in childhood that people in prison had experienced was just overwhelming in terms of physical abuse, domestic abuse, sexual abuse, and neglect. These were themes that came up time and time again, and specifically my kind of interest at the time was within the sex offence population and how we treat and rehabilitate this group. So I thought, actually, what can we do different in terms of early intervention? So within Bernardo's, I joined the child sexual abuse team, and predominantly focused on working with children and young people displaying harmful sexual behaviour. This experience was so different, and in terms of the level of supervision, it was like night and day. So when I walked into Bernardo's, the kind of structures that were in place, the support mechanisms that were in place in terms of group supervision, one-to-one supervision, these were things that I had never really had an experience of. And quite quickly within my practice, it definitely expanded my mind in terms of how I was able to leave things, for example, but also how I was able to process things in a better way. The thing with Bernardo's was the extent, the kind of range of experiences, and within our staff team, we were a really broad team, and I think what was really important was actually there was things that some of us just couldn't do. We just couldn't go there. And that was something in the prison service, again, I had never ever experienced. So an example of that was within a child sexual abuse service, I worked both with survivors of abuse, but also young people that had displayed harmful sexual behaviour or had offended against another child. Within our team, there was people that were, excuse me, really comfortable in working with child sexual abuse and working with survivors of abuse, but actually to go and work with the person that caused the harm was a place that they just could not physically go. And that could be a number of reasons in terms of, I suppose, their belief system, but also a number of reasons, including their own experiences, potentially of abuse in younger years. The themes that it was really clear was actually different experiences impacted us as a team differently. So my biggest issue was in response to neglect. I really struggled with neglect. So when I would go and do home visits and see children living in neglectful environments or where it had been evident there'd been maltreatment, those were things that affected me significantly more than some of the work I was doing within child sexual abuse. So it was a really good learning experience in terms of understanding what a team needs, but also the limitations of a team and how these themes play out differently for different people. So like we talk about a person-centered approach in terms of trauma for clients or people we support, there also needs to be that kind of person-centred approach in terms of supervision and professional reflection, because some experiences will be able to be tolerated better than others for other professionals. And then within this role, within the community safety and justice role, we have the kind of areas that we're experiencing at the minute are, like I say, specifically around restorative justice. And this is a completely different dynamic again, because I have comfortably worked with survivors and I've comfortably worked with people that have caused harm, but never have I ever worked with two people together on that same cycle. And that's been really different, and it's taken quite an extensive piece of learning, I suppose, for myself to be able to manage those dynamics in the same room and in the same space. And I'll kind of cover that as we go through. Okay. So in terms of impact and intervention, I think these are themes that I've pulled. So impacts, really, first of all, I suppose our themes I've pulled both from my own experiences, but also experiences of providing supervision to other professionals. So one of the things is when we're constantly living in this environment and we're working in these organisations, it becomes more than a job, and it becomes very much consuming in terms of your life. It becomes something that you think about more times than a day than not. And one of the big things is people always say is about, can you leave it at home or do you take it home with you? Now, I think that's really, really important. One of the things that I've mentioned here is in terms of impact. So in families and partners, there's 2 points here. It can impact in terms of our kind of relationships. There's days that we come home as professionals and we maybe don't speak very much, or we just want to do nothing. We just want to go to bed. We don't want to look anywhere else. We don't want to go to that party that night because of the things we've seen that day or the things we've heard that day. And I think there's something about how we work with our families and partners to ensure that people have something in place at home to know when we need those days and when we need those moments. There's also the bit about how much do you share at home. So some people that I speak to within supervision will say that they share absolutely nothing. They don't say a thing at home. Their work life is they can leave that environment, jump in the car, and it's there and it's left there. I think that's really important in terms of how everybody works differently. The other one of that is actually, is it useful to come home sometimes and have that conversation with your partner and say, what a day, I can't believe the world we live in, you know, and keep it vague in that sense. But the issue with that is in terms of families sometimes really don't get the world we work in. And I think of that in my own experience of my dad. I always think about in terms of, you know, his attitude in terms of prisoners is very, very different and away from where I sit. So those conversations sometimes actually cause more aggravation and cause more frustration because you don't get it. There is something about I wanted to touch on in terms of the impact on intimacy, both within relationships, within family members, but also within partners. And some of the themes we used to see within child sexual abuse services that we worked within was actually how we sometimes saw our own children differently, or how we would see family members' children differently, or sometimes how it actually disturbed certain relationships with our children. And I remember often working with one practitioner, and he was completely uncomfortable as a parent with bath time. And that had never been an issue for him prior to taking up this post. And he really, really struggled because of the work he was doing at this time, and it was all becoming too much. That was really, I suppose, really tricky and really, really quite awful for us to hear and understand that the work was actually having that level of an impact on someone to the point that they struggled to bath their own child. I think that was something for us that was really clear and really echoed the importance of understanding the level of work we do, but also at times when it's time to take a break and when it's time to step back potentially from a case or that area of work for a short period of time. There's also the personal and professional values that certainly can clash. So in terms of what we actually feel as a person, what our views and perspectives are, and then actually what we have to deal with professionally, certainly can have that impact on us, because we almost sometimes feel like we're contradicting ourselves. We feel that we're not actually practicing what we believe. And I think there's something in that as well to think about. We had a conversation maybe years ago in a meeting with a professional where their religion, for example, completely got in the way of their professional role and their professional values. And that was a real conflict of interest in terms of them as a person. And that took quite a significant amount of work through supervision to be able to get that line of actually having a professional belief system and a personal one. And then lastly, I've put safety. With this, and I cover this within a range of themes, but certainly that impact of safety and own safety is really, really clear. So certainly for me, in terms of when I go places now, I think about things like safety a lot more than I probably would have before. If I'm reading a particular case that day, I can see how it interrupts my daily routine or my nighttime routine. So for example, is the door shut? Is the door locked? Is the windows bolted over? Things that are potentially subconscious and we don't maybe give enough thought to. But recently we had a case where we had heard an experience of a person had entered someone else's house and committed a horrific sexual offence within that property. They had walked in the door, which was open, and then walked back out the door and shut the door behind them. That was massive for me in terms of the impact around actually that night. I can still remember my partner wasn't in, was away with work. And that was one of the nights for me that I was obsessed about locking the doors, checking the windows, something I had never done before. So it was about, no matter the experience, how experienced we are, actually certain things can just pop up, and certain things within cases really make us alerted to certain fields and certain areas we need to think about. In terms of interventions, I've included a few things. Practice supervision for me is really, really important in terms of it helps us understand the casework. It helps us understand models, research, etc., of how we practice kind of more clinical supervision in terms of what we're doing with the person, what are we going to do next, what approach are we going to do, and what about, it's all about them for me in terms of practice supervision. We're thinking about the actual case, the client. But what's really important is personal supervision. And with that is having a really solid relationship with a direct line manager or someone that we've identified as a mentor. But actually personal supervision is a place that we can really reflect on our own experiences and the impact potentially the cases are having on us. One of the things I would also note here is within personal supervision, some of the experiences I've talked about today and the people that I've worked with, I think it's really important to name this, is actually a lot of the people I've worked with have been really, really difficult to like. And even in terms of children and young people, I've worked with children and young people that personally have been really, really difficult to actually like. Now, sometimes that's something that we shut down because we think, oh, it's a professional place, we have to be able to do this work. But I think within that kind of reflective supervision, it's so important that we're able to identify relationships that are going to be really difficult, because we need to see if we can overcome them. Is it something we're going to be able to explore? And of listening to what they've just done to potentially a child or another person is really, really difficult. But I think it's important that they feel safe to be able to name that and that kind of strong view in that personal supervision. And then bringing the group together as well has been really useful in terms of my experience of having group and team supervision. So really bringing everyone together, not allowing people to be isolated and feeling that this work is something that they are in alone and that they're standing on alone. I think it just visually helps us see the team around us and helps us coordinate some of those dynamics together. It's also been an experience for me that in group supervision is an opportunity, if one of us is struggling with a particular case, actually we can use this space to say, is there anything we can do? Is it better that we maybe rethink about how we allocate these certain cases? So that's really, again, a kind of supportive place. And then unofficial supervision is that kind of constant, you leave a meeting and you need to speak to someone. So you phone a colleague and you have an absolute rant on the phone and say, I've just been at this meeting, raging, and I think that's important, is to be able to sit there and have those kind of spells of outburst. But that unofficial supervision that maybe happens more times than any of the clinical or practice supervisions, but actually having that strong team dynamic or relationship with a line manager to be able to pick up the phone and actually have in the car a conversation at that time to kind of take yourself away, allow yourself to vent, which allows you to carry on. You'll see, obviously, the bit is about in the middle. I've included kind of hobbies and knowing when to switch off. I think these are all things for me that have been really useful, and allowed me to kind of, I suppose, put my life in little departments in terms of the workload, where we do the work. And it's taken years to manage that. But then also I've got hobbies that I really, really enjoy. And those hobbies don't just support me in terms of coping strategies with what we do, but they also help me stop working. So they make me physically stop working because it's time to pick up that hobby which I need to do. Those are things I think is having those positive outlets and being able to actually have something in our lives. And that could be anything in terms of a hobby. It could be something really family integrated, but it is important, I think, certainly for my experience, to have that. And I think one of the things I would say is COVID has really impacted some of this in terms of the switching off aspect. We had this conversation just the other day, actually, within the team, that it's about, prior to COVID, the laptop would have got shut down at 5 o'clock. Practice teams would have been out the door and they'd have been back in the next day morning. It's far too easy now just to have the laptop on the dining room table all day and all night long. And I'm completely guilty of that. So actually walking past it, I'll just quickly check that. Well, it's 8 o'clock at night. Why are you just checking that? But it's not just about the overworking. It's actually about the overexposure, because we're not giving our brains a break from the material. We're not giving our brains that space to be able to stop and process and then pick up again. It's kind of constantly filtering in. So we've really tried in the team put a lot of things in place to try and prevent that and really discourage staff from actually doing that after 5 o'clock as and when possible. We know about burnout, and we know when people get to that stage of burnout where things are just impossible, we can't move on, we can't get away from that place. And I'm sure some of the other speakers potentially maybe pick up on this later on. But one of the themes I wanted to touch on was about blowout. And this is an attitude almost that I got exposed to at a really, really early stage in my career within prison service. And I've had it in every role since, of people saying, we just need a really good blowout. And basically a blowout is the attitude of, we're not coping, we're not managing, things are getting too much. Let's go out and let's get really drunk. And that was an attitude that I saw really clearly within the prison service, because it was that attitude of, as I told you, in terms of the hierarchy, the ecosystems that were in place within prisons, that was a much more suitable, or within those peer groups, appropriate way to cope with trauma or to cope with difficult situations. We obviously know that is completely unhelpful in terms of the long run. We all have those days that we need potentially a good night out, but actually what we could start to see, and what I have experienced with certain professionals, is that getting so consistent in their weekly basis. So it's not just a blowout once a year or a couple of times a year, it's actually becoming a weekly habit. And obviously that leads to much more kind of significant issues. But it's worth noting, and it is a term certainly that we hear quite a lot even now, that people are using as a coping strategy. So I think it is really important that we're kind of supporting to understand a little bit more about that, and why is it we get to that place in the first place? Why can't we do things before we get to the stage of we need to have a blowout? Okay, and so this is my last slide in terms of non-practice impact. So we had, like I say, worked really closely with crime analysts within the team. And when I first joined the team, I came in as a non-practice role, which was really, really difficult for me. And I probably struggled with that more than any other aspect of my career. Was coming in and being told to sit at a desk and write reports. It took a lot of getting used to. And then really quickly, I managed to convince them 6 months into my new job to let me go practice again, which was great. But what I was becoming really clear about was in that 6 months period, sitting working with crime analysts, was I actually found this almost more difficult to cope with, because I was reading about things, I was seeing statistics, growing statistics in our local authority, but I didn't feel like I had any impact. I didn't feel like I had any power in terms of how can I intervene? How can I disrupt some of this? How can I get out there? How can I raise the awareness? All we were asked to do was compile a data and compile a report to say sexual offences are on the rise. That really hit home to me in terms of how difficult that must be for people in an everyday role that are constantly reading about this material. And one of the analysts that I worked with was a single mum who had a really young child at home. And I ended up talking a lot to her about this and talking about the actual aspect. And this is someone that's never practiced. So she was purely a data analyst. She had never been in practice roles. And she started to talk me through some of the things that her routines were on a daily basis. So like the locking the doors. She would actually check under beds in a child's bedroom. She would not go out at a certain time at night in the winter time. And when I actually reflected this and talked through it with her, I said, is this obviously because of the stuff you're hearing? And when she thought about it, she said, well, it's just, she said, I just didn't realise how dark the world was. And it made me kind of think at that point of, is it, and I suppose this is a question in terms of, I don't necessarily have the answer to it. Is it almost easier as a practitioner because we're seeing it, but we're dealing with it? We're getting the correct level of supervision usually, but we're actually getting to experience it alongside the information, opposed to actually just sitting down and reading this material in an office that you share with environmental health. So in that room, we've got financial people, we've got admin, and then we've got a crime analyst sitting reading about a horrific rape. It just, to me, immediately caused alarm bells in terms of that material and that environment, and it just didn't seem trauma-informed at all, really. It was also about kind of some of the things she would look at in terms of CCTV, where she would be seeing things in her local community of acts of violence for people walking down the street, and then how that would impact her because she didn't drive. She only walked to work, and she had about 20-minute walk to work. In the winter time, it's quite dark. So it was all these things that really became apparent, and actually the impact that could have potentially on her. So that's just a kind of reflection, I suppose, from practice of a range of my experience, and I absolutely welcome any questions at all, and be more than happy to kind of facilitate a wee discussion around some of this work. But thank you very much. And if you want to find out more or you want to get in touch with me, my email address is there, so please feel free to do so.